Welcome to the universe next door. My name is Mike Berhow, and I'm excited to have with me today Dr. Stephen Meyer. Steve, how are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for reaching out. We're kitty corner across the country. I guess you're in Florida. I'm in Seattle. So
Well, when I first got introduced to you, Steve, I was actually a college student. So I remember way back when going to South Dakota State University, and a friend of mine gave me it was a DVD called "Unlocking the Mystery of Life's Origin," and that's where I first became introduced to you. When I was in grad school, I had a chance to read your book, "Signature in the Cell," and Darwin's Doubt. And most recently, you have a book here, "The Return of the God Hypothesis," which is what we're going to be talking about today. I'm excited to hear. I haven't had a chance to read this yet. I've read the first couple chapters, but I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I actually just recently listened to an interview that you did with Michael Shermer, and it was encouraging because I've also listened to some debates that you've done with him in the past, but it seems like his tone has changed a little bit. He's still not a fan of intelligent design. I think that would be fair to say. But he did say in that interview that this is not your father's creationism. This is far more serious. So it seems to me that maybe opinions about intelligent design have been changing over maybe the last decade. I don't know if that's been your perception, but I'd like to hear from you on that a little bit.
well, absolutely. First of all, Michael's a great guy. I mean, he's a real congenial figure and personable, and we had a really good discussion on his podcast. And I thought it was going to be for an hour, and it went for two. You know,
Right.
we covered all kinds of stuff. Um, but we've had a number of really high-profile scientific conversions or scientists who have maybe never thought that much about ID and then got exposed to it and realized, hey, there's a lot more science behind this than I realized. And and so we have a number of projects we're supporting right now with PhD students and postdocs working under senior scientists who are friendly to ID and doing ID-based research. So they're using the concept of intelligent design as a guide to research. So that's a sign of a maturing research program. Many of the initial books about intelligent design, including mine, were making an argument for intelligent design based on evidence that we already have. For example, in my case, the evidence of the sophisticated digital nanotechnology that's inside living cells, the information-bearing properties of DNA and RNA, and the evidence we have of an information storage, transmission, and processing system inside even the simplest living cells. I've argued that that provides powerful evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence. But many of the researchers that we're now connected with, senior scientists, are seeing in intelligent design a way of looking at life that's very different than the Darwinian reductionist materialist view, and realizing that if that view of life is correct, then there are certain things about life that we should expect to find that we wouldn't expect to find if life arose by a gradual Darwinian step-by-step sort of process. In other words, looking at life as a top-down product of intelligence rather than a bottom-up product of undirected material processes. And that's leading to predictions that can be tested in the laboratory. And so this is I think, a very exciting development. And some of those predictions are being borne out as well. One good example is just the discussion about so-called junk DNA, which up until 2009, 2010, you still had people making arguments against intelligent design based on the presence of junk DNA. The so-called junk DNA it refers to the section of the genome that is not coding for proteins, which is what the classical molecular biological explication of what's going on in the cell emphasized, which was that the DNA is translated into RNA, which then builds proteins. But the big sections of the DNA are not doing that. And so many neo-Darwinists thought that those sections were a consequence of the random trial and error process of mutation and selection, and that this was just an accumulation of mutational errors over a long period of time, thus the name junk DNA. And many of the early proponents of intelligent design felt that challenge, but also thought, well, if our view is correct, then we ought to see that the non-coding region, we would expect that those non-coding regions of the DNA would turn out to be importantly functional. This was an explicit prediction that was made by William Dembski, by Dean Kenyon, and someone who was quietly thinking about ID and sympathetic to it, Richard Sternberg, working in the field of genomics, began to investigate these non-coding regions and was finding extensive evidence of their functionality. And then the Big Encode project came out in 2011, I believe, showing that the ID perspective on this was entirely correct. What we expected, what we predicted, has been borne out by studies of the non-coding regions of the genome. So anyway, a good research program explains facts we already have, but it can also guide research and help us discover new things that we might not have discovered without the perspective of that research program. And that's beginning to happen, as well as a great multiplication of intellectual resources, lots and lots of people coming into the ID, especially younger, into the ID movement, especially younger scientists, but also that's happening internationally as ID research groups are popping up all over the world, Poland, Italy, Austria, Germany, Israel, and just explosive growth and interest in intelligent design in Brazil. So in fact, I'm going to speak on September 11th to the Ibero-Americano Congreso on intelligent design, featuring not just people from the US. In fact, I'm the only person from the US speaking on intelligent design. The others are professors from Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Chile. It's quite exciting, the international growth in the movement.
Yeah, that is exciting to hear. So with your new book, one of the things I've been wondering for a while, I've been following the intelligent design movement, like I said, since college. And in your first couple works, I mean, you're really telling the story of the scientific case of intelligent design, starting with the evidence that we have within the cell, the Cambrian explosion. But now in this new book, you're talking about the return of the God hypothesis. And one of the questions that I've always had, and when I've engaged with people who are maybe more critical of intelligent design, they've always been suspicious that this is a religious movement, not a scientific movement. So with your new book, how would you say that fits within the intelligent design movement? There's obviously the science piece. Yeah, just take it from there. So how does it fit with?
I think the suspicion is itself interesting because it presupposes that something can't be both, that science has no religious implications. And of course, people would like to stigmatize intelligent design as something that is based on a set of religious presuppositions. But this was something that Michael Denton laid out in his book, Evolution of Theory in Crisis, all the way back in 1985. He said the case for intelligent design is based on a strict application of scientific reasoning. It may have religious implications, but it's not based on scientific, on religious presuppositions. And so, you know, a lot of people want to convict intelligent design of the sin of religious belief, as if that would make it inherently disreputable. But we've long said that intelligent design may have larger religious or philosophical or worldview implications. And what I have done in this book is simply to spell out what I think those implications are. I'm not speaking for all of the ID movement in suggesting that the evidence we have from a number of fields in the natural sciences collectively supports an inference, yes, to intelligent design, but even more broadly or more specifically to a theistic design hypothesis. So to understand the theory of intelligent design is a theory that's based on scientific evidence and established methods of scientific reasoning. And we have long said it also may have theistic or certainly non-materialistic philosophical implications. And what I've done in this book is simply explain what I think those implications are.
Yeah. And I know at the beginning of the book, one of the things that's interesting, maybe on the other side of are there religious implications to intelligent design? You actually tell the story of how science was actually birthed in a religious context, specifically a Judeo-Christian context. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on those chapters just a little bit. Is this just a historical accident, or is there a reason why the Judeo-Christian worldview gave rise to science?
Well, it's interesting. I think most historians of science who study the period of the scientific revolution agree first that what we call modern science was birthed in a Judeo-Christian milieu or context, and that it was so birthed for specifically Judeo-Christian theistic reasons. We didn't need to tip our hats a bit to an earlier form of Islamic science that was also theistic, kind of died out, but there was Islamic scholars made some very significant contributions. I was in this book tracing the history of science in the West in particular, and if you look at the period of what's known as the scientific revolution, it's often dated between 1500 and 1750. Increasingly, historians of science are seeing that really the roots of it stretch back further into the late Catholic Middle Ages, developments in methods of reasoning that are essentially the basis of scientific methods of reasoning that were taking place at the University of Oxford and at the University of Paris. Figures like Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon were making really significant innovations in styles of reasoning that led to effective ways of interrogating nature, of investigating nature. But if we think that the period of the sort of agreed upon period of the scientific revolution, we look at figures like Kepler and Boyle and Newton. These were almost exclusively very religiously devout investigators of nature, and they were investigating nature for very specifically religious reasons. There's a wonderful book by Rodney Stark, the former University of Washington, now Baylor historian of science, titled "For the Glory of God," published with Princeton University Press. And Stark explains that this was the motivation of the early scientists. They were trying to bring glory to God by revealing through their study the design and the order, the mathematical harmony, and the intelligibility of nature. That nature was clearly a system that revealed a hidden rationality. And so one of the key ideas of the scientific revolution, in fact, was the idea that nature was intelligible, that because it had been made in the image of a rational creator who had also made our minds in his same image, there was a principle of correspondence between what Sir John Polkinghorne, recently died, a Cambridge physicist who became an Anglican cleric. Polkinghorne talked about the reason within matching the reason without, that there's a built-in rationality in nature that we can perceive because we've been gifted with the rationality of God, who also is the source of the rationality in nature. So that was just one key idea. I look at others, like the idea of the contingency of nature, the idea that God, yes, built an order into nature, but the order could have been otherwise, because God is a free moral agent, and he could have chosen to build all kinds of different order in nature. So we can't just deduce what would seem to be the most rational way of building the universe from a kind of standpoint of armchair philosophy. We've got to go and look at nature to see how he actually built it. And this led to empirical methods of investigation. So a number of theological ideas were key to giving the impetus for science, but also key to developing an empirical science that relied on observation and much less on kind of a priori philosophizing, as some of the Greeks were prone to do.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So after those chapters, then you start to walk through the case then for how science gives us reason to believe in a God who transcends the universe. You talk about the Big Bang, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life, the Cambrian explosion. So could you just take a few moments to walk through that overall argument that you're making and why you think that presents a case for transcendent God of the universe?
Yeah, maybe one way just to explain this briefly in an interview form is is to first explain what I'd done in the previous books. With Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, I argued that the information-bearing properties of living cells and living animals suggested the prior activity of a kind of master programmer. Bill Gates has famously said DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. We know from experience that the programs come from programmers, they come from intelligent agents, and that information, especially information in a digital or alphabetic or typographic form, always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a computer program or a paragraph in a book or a newspaper headline or information embedded in a radio signal. Information is the product of intelligence. We've got a 4-character digital code at work inside the DNA molecule. It's part of a larger information storage, transmission, and processing system. Richard Dawkins recently tweeted that he was knocked sideways with wonder at this digital nanotechnology that's at work inside the cell, and he said he was in even more awe of the scientists who had worked it all out. But what he didn't say was anything about how it originated. And he had previously acknowledged in an interview with Ben Stein in a film about 10 years ago that, quote, no one knows how life first arose with all that. He referred to it as a signature of intelligence, but then attributed that intelligence to, if intelligent design was in fact, if it did in fact play a role in the origin of life, he suggested it would have had to come from an intelligence in outer space that itself evolved by some prior undirected materialistic or chemical evolutionary process. I made the case in Signature in the Cell, or a case in Signature in the Cell, for the intelligent design of life based on its information-bearing properties, but I didn't attempt to identify the designing intelligence. And there's 2 obvious possible sources of that intelligence, if in fact we're looking at evidence of a design, which I've argued that we are. One is the space alien designer that Dawkins alluded to, which Francis Crick actually proposed at one point. It's a theory called panspermia, an intelligent agent immanent within the cosmos. The other possibility is the idea that we're looking at evidence of intelligent design, and the source of that design is a transcendent intelligence, AKA something like God. And so what I did in the book was I reprised those biological arguments, but then asked my readers to consider other evidence that could help us adjudicate between those 2 great possibilities. And I looked at evidence from physics in what physicists call the fine-tuning of the universe. This refers to the exquisite and highly improbable set of physical parameters, the values and strengths of physical parameters that make life possible. Sometimes physicists talk about the fine-tuning as they refer to our universe as a Goldilocks universe. The elementary particles are not too heavy, not too light. The force that's responsible for the expansion of the universe outward from the Big Bang is not too strong, not too weak. The other fundamental forces of physics, the electromagnetic force, gravitational force, the strong and weak nuclear forces, fall within very narrow tolerances, outside of which life would be impossible. Even basic chemistry would be impossible in the universe. And so you have this array of factors that have very precise values and strengths that fall within these very narrow limits that allow life to exist in the universe. And collectively, they're immensely improbable, almost beyond computation. And there is no underlying physical reason for these values having the values that they have. So this fine-tuning is one of the very powerful evidences of design. But interestingly, many of these parameters are set from the very beginning of the universe or very soon after, and would have been in place long before any alien intelligence or even our intelligence could have evolved to determine them. So clearly no space alien intelligence, no immanent intelligence within the cosmos could be responsible for the design of the entire universe itself and for the fine-tuning of the parameters that make its own life possible. So in presenting the fine-tuning evidence, I had in mind the idea that evidence was going to help us adjudicate between these 2 competing design perspectives, an immanent versus a transcendent intelligence. And then I also discussed the evidence for the origin of the universe itself and what's now known as the Big Bang Theory, or perhaps the inflationary cosmological model, both of which presuppose that the universe itself had a beginning. And the evidence we have from modern astrophysics and cosmology has amply supported that conclusion, that as best we can tell, the universe itself, the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy came into existence a finite time ago, before which we cannot invoke matter and energy as a cause, because after all, it's matter and energy that come into existence at that point. We can't invoke a prior physics because there is no physics yet. There's no physical reality until the physical universe comes into existence. So the origin of the universe a finite time ago, I think, presents a unique explanatory challenge to any kind of scientific materialistic construct, and instead suggests the need for some sort of external creator to the universe. Theism and also deism posit a creator that exists independent of the universe, and who has great power and intelligence, and therefore, if such an entity exists, it could provide an explanation for the origin of the universe in a finite time ago, whereas materialism lacks explanatory resources to do that. So in looking at, in broadening the search window, looking not just at evidence from biology, but also evidence from physics and cosmology, I was able to present a case for a theistic design hypothesis as the best overall explanation. If you look at those three classes of evidence, you see evidence of a transcendent cause, which is also intelligent, capable of fine-tuning the universe, and which also must act long after the beginning in order to explain the origin of the information and the complexity of living cells. So a transcendent intelligence that is also active in nature is a picture of a theistic God rather than a space alien or even a deistic creator, positing a deistic creator might explain the origin of the universe and its fine-tuning, but not the origin of anything that happens long after the beginning, such as the origin of life, with the evidence of design that it now presents to us.
Could you explain, so thinking about the deist version of creating the universe, could you explain why, more specifically, why that doesn't work, like a front-loaded version? What makes that not plausible in your mind?
Well, right. I have a whole chapter on that, chapter 15 in the book. There aren't many deists around today, in truth. I mean, this is a worldview that kind of lost popularity somewhere in the 19th century. But there is a deistic style explanation for the origin of life that you could propose. You could say, well, yes, life arose on Earth 4.5 billion years, or 4 billion years ago, 10 billion years after the Big Bang, plus or minus. I think the most natural thing to conclude from that is that the evidence that we have at that point of the origin of life, the evidence we have of design, the digital code and DNA, points to an activity about that time in the history of the cosmos. And therefore, the designing agent could not have been a deistic God, because a deistic God, by definition, acts only at the beginning. But some theistic evolutionists who are not, in fairness, not deists, because they believe that God is constantly upholding the laws of nature, but they're reluctant to posit God's activity in any specific way after the beginning. And in that way, they hold a tenet. The tenet of their view is similar to deism. They've proposed that that God might have front-end loaded the design at the beginning of the universe, arranged all the elementary particles and the energy right at the point of the Big Bang, so that eventually things would unfold in the way that would, in such a way as to produce life. And I've shown that that's really scientifically implausible. Just in the first instance, the beginning of the universe was after the Big Bang. Physicists think that the universe existed in a plasma state. We didn't even get stable atoms forming until 380,000 years after the Big Bang. So you don't have any carriers, any possible carriers of information in that sort of a system, and any molecules that would be capable of carrying information that would be life relevant would have been destroyed in the intense heat of that initial universe. But beyond that, it gets into a little bit of the details of things. But I show that the DNA molecule contains information in virtue of a specific arrangement of some of its chemical subunits. They're called bases, or nucleotide bases. And the DNA is specifically made of sugars, phosphates, and these bases. And it turns out that if you have a prebiotic soup of sugars, phosphates, and bases, that does not an information-rich DNA molecule make. The bases have to be arranged in very specific ways, and the chemical forces of attraction between those different constituents of the DNA molecule do not determine their specific arrangement. You can see this by an examination of the DNA molecule, what's called the structural formula of the DNA molecule. There's perfect chemical freedom for the bases to attach at the backbone. The backbone is the medium of the genetic message. The arrangement of the bases is the message itself. And there's perfect chemical freedom for the bases to attach anywhere along the backbone that they like. It'd be a little bit like if you have magnetic letters and a metallic surface like a refrigerator. The refrigerator isn't going to dictate the arrangement of the metallic your letters, because they can attach anywhere they want on the refrigerator. You have to arrange them to spell a message. And so my point in all this was to point out that even if you had life-relevant chemical subunits from the very beginning of the universe, there's nothing about the chemical interactions between those subunits that would determine the arrangement that constitutes the information in those molecules. So if there isn't information in the sugars, phosphates, and bases that determines their arrangement, then surely there wasn't such information in the plasma state or the elementary particles at the very beginning of the universe. Something happened long after that generated the information, and it wasn't basic chemistry.
Right. Yeah.
That's the argument.
So yeah, so you're making the case.
And therefore, a deistic creator, it's implausible to think that the conditions for life were front-end loaded at the beginning.
Right. Yeah. It's like a pool player who makes this incredible trick shot rather than just hitting one at the time. So throughout the history of the cosmos.
That's the analogy. And there's just a whole bunch of scientific reasons why that analogy is not apt in the case of explaining the origin of life. I spell them all. There's a lot more to this actually in chapter 15 in my book, but it's scientifically implausible in the extreme to think that all the information necessary to build a simple living cell, let alone even a single or a complex organism, was present at the beginning of the universe.
Yeah, that's helpful.
It must have arisen later. Therefore, there must have been an active design later, and therefore the deistic hypothesis, I think, is inadequate to explain that class of evidence.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we're actually just about out of time. So if you could maybe just take a moment, if somebody were wanting to learn more about intelligent design, obviously we have your books, but what are some other resources that you would point them to if they want just a basic introduction to the science of intelligent design?
Well, a very good, we have a little book that Bill Dembski did called Intelligent Design 101. We have a cartoon book some authors have done. I think you can find it on Amazon, called What's Darwin Got to Do with It, for younger people. The film that you mentioned, Unlocking the Mystery of Life, does a great job in 58 minutes and 30 seconds for a PBS audience of explaining intelligent design. It's a little dated. I look a lot younger in that film, but it's fun. I'm quite partial just to the explanation of intelligent design what in my first book, Signature in the Cell, because I've had the great advantage of coordinating a lot of this research effort. And so I've been able to work in the books that I've written. I've often been able to synthesize the work of other scientists in our movement. And what I did in that book was explain what was going on in molecular biology, and then explain how methods of design detection, some developed by William Dembski, help us to perceive the design that's present in that complex digital information storage, transmission, and processing system. So we have, if you go on our websites, there's just awful lot of different things from which to choose. There's a very fine introductory video that's online called Information Enigma, the Information Enigma. It's, I think, 20 minutes long, and it gives a really nice explanation of some of the basics of intelligent design.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Thank you for joining us today on The Universe Next Door.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me on.